Welcome, everyone. We're going to call the meeting to order. I know you're still eating, but we want to leave plenty of time for our speaker today. So, welcome. It's good to be back. We had our summer break, and we're happy to be back for our September dinner. So, thank you so much. We want to recognize any elected officials here. I know we have Maureen Cox from School Board. We have Lisa Sandberg, our chair of the Republican Party. Did I miss anyone else that came in? I know we have some city council candidates. Thank you for being here with us. Good luck as the numbers keep coming in here. So thank you. Sorry. Well, I'm gonna get to Celeste. Sorry, don't worry. We won't forget her. Thank you. We're gonna get to her in a second. A couple of announcements to mark your calendars for. We have, let's see, a couple events coming up. I might go out of order here, but the Dixie Roundup Parade is next Saturday, and our Republicans will have a float in there, so we'd love to have you come ride with us, walk with us. That's going to meet at 8 a.m., and what date is that? The 16th, the Saturday. So if you're interested in that, that's always fun. And then the following, so Constitution Day is the 17th, but that's a Sunday, we're gonna have the county parties hosting a fun Constitution Day on the 18th, the Monday. And that is, I may have said that day wrong. Did I say that right? Anyways, we're doing a fun Constitution game. If you think you know the Constitution really well, you should be a contestant. They're still looking for contestants. So let Lisa know or email them, and we'd love to have you on that. It's going to be kind of a fun game show audience as well. So if you want to participate in that, then get with us. Constitution Day. Where is it located? At the city, the recreation center. The community center. Washington Community Center is where that's going to be. So take note of that. We also have a new elephant club down here. If you're not familiar with that, it's a fundraising club for the state party, and it's always been up north, but we just opened a southern chapter. So if you're interested in joining, you can join the first month. That's also going to be the 18th also. So you can take note of that. Let's see.
That's 19th. No, that's
19th. Sorry, I always say I'm wrong numbers. It got moved to Monday, so it was on there as the 19th. Sorry. And then lastly, another calendar caucus has officially been announced for March 5th. That's the Super Tuesday. So I know that's a little ways out, but make sure you're aware of that and get all your neighbors to go. Because it's the presidential election, that is where you're going to vote for president. We'll be doing the way that the state party has set it up with the state. That's going to be where you cast your vote for president. So you'll want to show up to caucus night for that primary. And I think that's all, unless I missed any important dates. So we will open with a prayer by our chairwoman, Lisa Sandberg, and then we're going to turn the time over to Karen Andrew. She's filling in for Charlotte today, and she's going to give our Americanism and pledge. So we'll go to that point.
Our Father in heaven, we are so grateful to be gathered tonight as the Washington County Republican women. So grateful for our guest speaker, that he could come and talk to us. And grateful for Abby and them providing us a good meal. And we are so grateful to live in this country and to live in a country where we have elections, and I'm grateful for the outcomes of the elections that we had on Tuesday. We're asking you to help us to never take for granted the freedoms that we enjoy. Help us to do what is necessary to keep our country free. And we ask the Spirit and blessing upon this meeting. And we say this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
So Charlotte had 3 pages. I'm going to consolidate that. But in doing that, I think that those that would benefit from it aren't in this room. You're probably very well aware of how important the Constitution is. So it's going to be emailed to you. Make sure to share that with somebody who's young and might not know that. So that's our hope. I'm going to read one quote from it, so it's out of context since you don't have her full speech, but it's a Thomas Jefferson quote. I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. And so something to think about, and then we'll go ahead with the Pledge of Allegiance. Please stand. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Karen, for helping us out tonight. We're going to forego our membership report. We don't have too much to talk about this time, but I will just make note. I know it's a little confusing. If you want to renew your membership for next year, you can start following October, November, December. Any of those times you can renew your membership for the following calendar year. So, and if you're a GEM member, as you saw tonight, we had a little preception there for those GEM members. GEM members help us fundraise. They get a little extra beyond their membership, and we really appreciate that. Be sure to grab a treat on the way out if you didn't get that earlier. So thank you. Okay, well, now the rest of the program, I want to bring up our newest primary winner, Congresswoman Celeste Malloy. Proud of you. She's been a member of the Republican Women for a while, and we're excited for her. So she can say a few words, and then I'll turn the time over. Well, she can turn the time over to Shirley to introduce our speaker. So congratulations. Oh, I was going to mention, I'm sure she's going to want your help campaigning for the rest of the year. So if you want to donate, help her out, get in touch. So.
Thank you. I'm not going to take up much time. I know everybody's here to hear from Steve, but I just want to say thank you. I know that a lot of you have donated, a lot of you have spent time, a lot of you have signs in your yards, and I know some of you have even been brave enough to get online and try to correct some of the things that have been said online, which makes you a lot braver than me. I've stayed away. So thank you. I appreciate everything you're doing. Since the race was called last night, it's time now for the Republican Party to come back together. I know primaries are really hard because it pits Republicans against Republicans. And now it's time to move past that to where we're all on the same team, we all believe in the same platform, and we all want to get a Republican elected to Congress. So I'm here saying thank you to everybody who's been helping and extending my hand to anybody who was supporting anybody else in the race and saying I'm ready to get to know you, to answer your questions. Let's be strong and united going into the general. So thank you.
Go Celeste. If you have read Mr. Studdert's bio, and if you haven't, you really should, then you'll understand why I have nicknamed him Superman. He has worked with, as White House advisor for 3 presidents, and for 3 more as on special assignment. He has represented these presidents in diplomatic assignments to over 100 nations, and the list goes on. But what the bio doesn't tell you, my favorite part, Mr. Studdert is an optimist. He can't sing. It's impossible to beat him at Scrabble. He dearly loves baseball and will go to great lengths and great distances to get to the game. His vices in life are cheese and salami. And he even calls cheese his birthstone. He reads voraciously. He drives way too fast, but he's a great driver. He never, ever forgets a name. His hobby is his family, especially his 28 grandchildren.
He earned a master's degree in international security, I think just last year. He didn't tell his children that he was even working on it. They found out when they got the announcement in the mail. Adjectives that I have heard describe him are amazing, honorable, smart, wonderful, wise, and loving. So, Mr. Studdert, if you have time, I'd like to hear about Nancy Reagan and the shuttle launch, and how you built a fence around President Reagan in an hour. So, I am honored to give the mic to Mr. Stephen Superman Studdert.
Thank you.
So, you think?
I don't know where she heard all that stuff. Sterling, I definitely want you to speak at my funeral. What were the two things you want me to tell you? Nancy Reagan.
And the shuttle launch.
So I had made this recommendation for President Reagan, and I'd made it to the Deputy Chief of Staff, that he should attend on the 4th of July, the landing of the space shuttle and the launch of a new space shuttle. And the Deputy Chief of Staff said, no, that's just too complicated. We're not doing that. So I went back in the next morning and I made the recommendation that he do it. And he said, didn't you hear me yesterday? We're not doing it. So the third day I go in and say, I have a recommendation. I made the recommendation again. Then he kind of shook his head and he said, let's go see the Chief of Staff. So we walked down the hall to Jim Baker's office. Baker was later the Secretary of Treasury and Secretary of State. And he says to Baker, Studdert has a crazy idea. Jim says, lay it out, so I did. He said, well, could you do it? And I said, sure, we could do it. And he said, well, let's go talk to the president. So we walk in the Oval Office, and the introduction is, Studdert has a crazy idea, Mr. President. The president said, let's hear it. So I laid it out, and the president said, well, I think that sounds like fun. Let's do it. So here's the Nancy Reagan space shuttle piece. The space shuttle was going to land, and it was going to land at Edwards Air Force Base in California. And then there's a period of about an hour where the astronauts have to be checked by the physicians to make sure they didn't bring any COVID back from wherever they were. And then the president was going to go out and address the crowd. There were 800,000 people in the VIP area. There were about 4 million in the general public area. And then the plan was that the president would authorize the launch of the next space shuttle. So here was the question. We were talking on a secret classified communications channel with the space shuttle. And we had to give them the go or no-go signal as they crossed India to either begin their return to Earth or make another orbit. And the determining factor was whether the First Lady's hair was done or not. Earl, I've never told that story publicly. I think it's still secret. It was kind of fun. And I won't bore you with all the details. There's so much backstory behind the whole event. But we worked it out so that the new space shuttle, which was Columbia. Oh, by the way, we told the president and first lady, now you're going to go out and you're going to stand at the door of the space shuttle, and the astronauts are going to come down, and whatever you do not touch the space shuttle. What do you think the first thing Nancy did was? Go over and touches it. Anyway, the plan was that the president, when he was speaking, when he got to paragraph 27, he would say, Columbia, you're cleared to take off. And this 747 with a space shuttle strapped to its back would take off. So we had worked with the pilots so that by the time the president got to, and I told him, I said, you can't ad-lib, Mr. President, you got to stay right on this. And I told him why. And he understood. One thing's great about him is he worked his whole career with directors. And so when I tell him something, he was good. So I'll tell you about one that he wasn't good. Anyway, so here was the plan, that when he got to paragraph 27 and said, Columbia, you're clear to take off, this aircraft was already rolling down the runway. And it took off, came over, flew right over this crowd of nearly 500,000 people at 200 feet off the deck and tipped its wings. And off it goes. And the president, with the mic open, starts to sing God Bless America. And whoever was running the mic, fortunately, didn't turn it off. And that's the only time I ever heard a president kind of soloing with 500,000 people singing with him. And it was on the 4th of July. So it turned out okay. My job was saved for another day. I'll tell you about one where he didn't do what he was asked to do. The president was going to Berlin. This was Reagan again. And the way president's speeches get written is a little bit complicated, and that's the same for every president, every administration. If the president's going to speak to the National Turkey Growers Convention, Celeste and I have a relationship of turkeys. It goes way back. Some staff person will write the speech. The president generally won't have any input in it. And maybe the Secretary of Agriculture or others in that particular sector will have input. If he's going to give a major foreign policy address, the president generally will invite in the speechwriters and say, here's the message I want to give. And then the National Security Council has input, the State Department has input. So Reagan is going to the Berlin Wall. He's going to stand at Brandenburg Gate. He's going to address probably 1 million people in Berlin, which is then West Berlin. The wall was still up. And Reagan told him what he wanted to say. The draft came back, and he looked at it. He took a pen, and he wrote on there, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Send it back into the process. The State Department objected. Said, Mr. President, you can't say that. That's too provocative. The National Security Council aligned with the State Department. The next draft comes back, it's gone. The president took a pen, wrote on there, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Goes in the process. We're on Air Force One flying into Berlin. The president's looking at this text of his speech. It's not there. The president took out a pen, wrote right on the speech text, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And history has recorded the most famous thing that Ronald Reagan said in his 8 years of being president of the United States was that line, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall. There's another little piece of that. The whole relationship with the United States and the Soviet Union changed during the Reagan presidency. And remember, Reagan was the president who called the Soviet Union the evil empire. And the president went to, where did we go? We went to Reykjavik, Iceland, to meet with Gorbachev. And that was their first meeting, as I recall. And it was going very poorly. And Reagan said to Mr. Gorbachev, let's you and I just go out in the boathouse and visit. And they did. And from that moment on, our two countries weren't friends necessarily. In fact, we were really kind of institutional enemies. We stood for very opposite things. But Reagan and Gorbachev established this relationship that we can work together. And from that, ultimately into the breakup of the Soviet Union. I was in Russia 2 days before the Soviet Union fell. I was sent there. My wife and I were I didn't plan to tell any of this stuff. It's not in my notes here, Sterling. You got me all off track here. I had a wonderful speech prepared. My wife and I were in New York, Christmas shopping and whatever you do at, Radio City Music Hall and the things you do at Christmas in New York City. I got a phone call from the White House and it was, could you go to Moscow, Russia this afternoon? And this was maybe 4 or 5 days before Christmas. And of course the answer is sure. So they said, okay. And I remember they said, somebody will meet you at the airport. And they met me and they gave me an American Express card with my name on it that had unlimited purchasing capacity. which was very tempting to my wife to say, I'll take the card. And the suitcase with $100,000 cash in it, which was also tempting to Bonnie. Anyway, I went to Moscow, and my assignment was there were 150 or thereabouts American foreign exchange students that were scattered about the Soviet Union. The US government didn't know quite where they were, and we had to get them out. And for some reason, I don't know why, they didn't want the embassy to do it. So my assignment was to go get these kids home. And Bonnie said, and get them home before Christmas. And we found all those kids, and I took my cash and hired a Polish army plane, and we got them out. But I remember watching this major country of the world, the Soviet Union, collapse. I'm an American, and 4 days before the Soviet Union ended, I was at the airport of Moscow. I walked unchallenged, to tell you how bad things were. I walked unchallenged up into the control tower at the airport. I counted 145 Soviet airliners, commercial airliners, Aeroflot, sitting on the ramp. They were there because there was no fuel. The Russians were out of fuel. They had no money, no currency that was working, no currency that was accepted. The country was collapsing by the hour. And the only planes that could fly in, commercial aircraft, were ones that had enough fuel to fly back out. And we got those kids out and got them home in time for Christmas. And I remember looking at my hotel room door, which was right on Red Square. Every opportunity I get, I'd look out the window rather, to see what flag was flying over the Soviet Union. See if it was still the Soviet Union flag. And so years go by, and Ronald Reagan dies. And I thought this was the most telling moment of his presidency. Mikhail Gorbachev came to Washington, D.C., came to the United States Capitol, where Reagan's body lay. Where's English teachers? Which is it? Lady State, okay. I've never been able to, my English teacher must have failed, because I've never been able to get that one right. It wasn't the student, it was clearly the teacher.
Of course.
And so they stopped the public lines for Gorbachev to go there. Now that was an amazing statement, that the last general secretary of the Soviet Union would come to pay respect to the President of the United States as he laid in honor, okay, in the Capitol of the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol building. What was so significant, and I think the telling moment of the entire Reagan presidency, was Gorbachev walked up to Reagan's casket, which is draped in an American flag. He stood at that casket, put his hand on the American flag, which is an unheard of thing for a Soviet or Russian leader to do. It's against every rule. And then bowed his head in prayer for his friend. And I think that tells us so much about the American presidency and American leadership. Lisa, you talked about, that's you. Aren't you Lisa?
Lisa's there.
There you are. You talked about freedom and elections. I had an experience, by the way, Celeste, congratulations. That was what I was going to start with. We've been blessed in the 2nd Congressional District to be represented by, I think, as fine a member as there is the United States House of Representatives, Chris Stewart. I think and there's a great loss in Chris leaving. But I feel okay now that you're going to be there. And I know there's supposedly another election in November, the 21st, I think. But I think you got that one in the bag. Now, don't coast.
I'm incapable of coasting. I'll keep working.
Perfect. And you all do like they do in Chicago, vote early and vote often. And you'll be there. So, excuse me, Lisa, as you talked about freedom, I was thinking about an experience I had once. I spent a lot of time by assignment in Serbia and Bosnia and Croatia after the war, the conflict, mostly over, not totally over. I remember sitting one Sunday morning, and this is how goofy some things are. I was sitting in the United Nations observation point up on a hill in an easy chair, having breakfast, as we watched two countries fight each other down this valley. Does that just seem strange? Well, as you
Kind of
talk,
seems dumb. You're up there in the middle of the bar.
dumb that I was there or dumb that they're, well, you and my wife don't need to talk. She would often say, "You're where?" So I want to tell you about a man in Bosnia. His name was Hussein. And he and his family were Muslims living in a predominantly Serbian Orthodox neighborhood. They had lived there for generations, gotten along just fine. And one evening, Serbian forces pushed through. You think about freedom that we have here. They pushed through Hussein's hometown, systematically killing, house by house, their Bosnian neighbors, men, women, children. So Hussein and his extended family took refuge under the floorboards of their Serbian neighbor's home. And they were hiding there, and they'd been neighbors for years, and this ethnic and religious background difference didn't bother them. But they huddled in this cold, damp cellar, Hussein and 16 members of his family. Now think about that. Can you imagine having to go hide under your neighbor's cellar floorboards to protect your family? So the Serbians came into the house. They could hear them going room by room above their heads. And then Hussein's life changed forever. And he shared this story. He was a young father. He was 20 years old at the time. And he had a 3-month-old daughter that was in his wife's arms. And the daughter began to cry. And he then strangled and suffocated this child to save the rest of the family's lives. I appreciate your prayer, Lisa, because we take freedom for granted all too often. And it's not free. There is a price. And Hussein strangled that little child to death so that they could maybe live the way we take for granted. You also talked about elections. I remember I was on an election monitoring team in Hungary, and it was the first free election they'd had in 1,100 years. And I remember I'm in this precinct, or whatever they call them, and I'm supposed to be watching for election integrity and election corruption. And I see the election workers take a ballot box and walk out the door. And I'm thinking, it's like Chicago. So I followed them. That wasn't it at all. There was an old woman who was infirm and unable to come to the polling place, and so they were taking the polling place to her. So she could vote her conscience for the first time freely in what had been the Communist Republic of Hungary. There was another man, and 2 men came in, and I noticed that they went behind the curtain in the same, what do you call those things? Ballot booth? What are they called?
Ballot box.
No, voting booth, yeah. Thank you. If I prepared a speech, I wouldn't have to do this. But I remembered, as you talk about elections, I remember these 2 went in this ballot booth, what do you call it, voting booth, and pulled the curtain. And I thought, well, there's some hanky-panky here of some kind. So I watched, and pretty soon they came out. It was an old man and a younger man. The old man had a ballot in his hand, and he went over to the ballot box where you put him in, and he was doing that. And I realized he was blind. He was trying to find the slot to put his ballot. So I inquired, what are the 2 of you doing in there? He said, this is my son. He came in, and the man started to cry. He came in there to read the ballot to me. For the first time in my life, I could vote freely. That's how much it meant to them. And as I think, Celeste, about your election coming up in November, how important it is. When we voted for Celeste, we voted for principles. Not a pretty woman, but principles. Now, beautiful, yes, but that's not why. We voted for who you are and what you stand for. And you realize how important and how sacred, in my view, the privilege of voting is. And so, Lisa, I appreciate your prayer. Carrie, you talked about the pledge. As I looked at the flag, I hadn't thought about this one either. President George Bush Sr. was going to Poland, which was a communist country still. And I went over there a month ahead of time to figure out what his trip could look like. And I remember I met with the president of the country, who was then the general secretary of the Communist Party of Poland. And I said, we want the president to go to the city of Gdansk. No, you can't. Well, I'm gonna go there this afternoon, Mr. General Secretary. Well, you can't. Well, I am. I knew they wouldn't arrest me, so at least I hope they wouldn't. And so I went up there and we looked, and I met with a man named Lech Walesa, who was the leader of the Solidarity movement. And we made a plan for the president to go to Gdansk, Poland when he came. And so the president went to Gdansk, and I remember driving in the motorcade that day. There must have been 1 million people in this great huge square. And what struck me, how many American flags were flying, which was against the law at the time in Poland. And as I thought, well, the salesman from Taiwan would beat us here. That was not it at all. Many of them were old American flags, less than 48 stars, that these Polish people had hidden away for years as against the law, as a reminder of what their desire in life was to be free like the United States of America. The rest of the flags obviously were homemade. They were the wrong blues, the wrong reds, wrong numbers of stars, and they were absolutely beautiful. And they had made them, and then they brought all these flags out to celebrate the President of the United States coming to Gdansk, Poland. We had the president hosted a luncheon after. And at the luncheon were democracy advocates, the communist leadership, and the solidarity union workers. And I was hosting a table. It was very much like this, and I'm hosting a table, and a lady is seated to my left, and she's a democracy advocate who'd spent a lot of time in prison and just gotten out. And she'd been in prison for simply being an advocate of freedom. And the guy next to me, she leans across me and she said, "You put me in jail for whatever number of years it was. It was a long time." And I remember he leaned back across, he said, "Yes, but I got you a good cell." And I thought, this is gonna be an interesting lunch. And so I remember the waiter came along and brought us, they served lovely lunch, hosted by the President of the United States, so you know it's a lovely luncheon. And they brought around a platter of sliced beef, and they served her, and she started to cry. I'm thinking, what's wrong with our beef here for lunch? She said, "I haven't had a piece of meat in, I think, 6 years." And I had the waiter go package up the whole tray and send it home with her. Sometime later, I went back to Gdansk, and I went to the Gdansk shipyard, which is where the whole freedom movement really began. And there's a man standing there at the gate guard. He had a Navy pea coat on. And he came over to me and he, through our interpreter, said, "You've been here before. I recognize you." And I'm thinking, okay. And I said, "Yes, I have been here before." And he opened his pea coat and he took out a solidarity banner that he had rolled up inside of his coat. And he laid it out on the street to show me. And it had all these stains on it. He said, "Those stains are blood." He said the shipyard workers stood across the gate right where we were standing and said to the communist government, "We will not live this way any longer." And the Russian tanks came right nose to nose with them. And the Russian officers told them, "Stand aside or you'll be crushed." They wanted freedom so badly, they didn't move. And the blood on that banner was those shipyard workers who were crushed by the Soviet tanks. And he rolled that banner up and gave it to me. And I cherish that. And it's a reminder of the things we said in the pledge and how important the American flag is and what it stands for. So I don't want to, based upon what I learned at dinner, what do you want to talk about? I have to tell Colleen that for years it troubled me that I would go into the Oval Office and I would kind of say to myself, what is a kid from Spanish Fork, Utah doing in here?
I wondered that too.
I think the presidents did too. And one day it dawned on me that not everybody could be from Spanish Fork.
That's right.
And from then on, I was fine. I promised my wife the first time we went to Washington, by the way, I was in Washington DC yesterday. And who said,
My old
Sterling, you said
My
something,
old neighborhood.
you were up on Wisconsin. I drove down Wisconsin yesterday or the day before. Sterling, you talked about baseball. I did take in the Washington Nationals ball game Tuesday night. I had my priorities. So, what would you like to talk about? I was told that I should let you tell me what to talk about, so please.
I just want to know, how did you start in this? Like, the question I've gotten, how did you start your political journey? When did you start?
When I graduated from undergraduate school at BYU, my grandfather asked me, what are you going to do for a career in your life? And I said, I don't know, but I'm never going to work for the government. And it was sort of serendipitous. My wife, we were young married, and we were living in Brigham City at the time. And President Ford, who was then President Nixon's vice president, owned a condo in Vail, Colorado. He owned half. The other half interest was owned by a guy in Tremont. And I got to know that guy, and somewhere along the way, I got some national praise for my position, and he said, you know, you ought to work at the White House. And I said, yes, I should. And you can't apply for a job at the White House. It's all by invitation. And I was invited and promised my wife we'd only stay 18 months. And that didn't work out so well. And I didn't think that I'd go back for a second, let alone a third. And I always felt very privileged that of all the things in America one could be asked to do to serve the President of the United States and serve the country and the interests of the country. And I was privileged to serve presidents who really sincerely had the interest of the country at heart. I remember one of them saying once, he was being recommended something, a policy thing, and they said, well, the polls say, and he cut them off. He said, I'm not interested in what the polls say, I'm interested in what's best for America. And I was privileged to serve those kinds of presidents. And I never thought that that's what I would do, and never thought I'd do it for as many times as I kept going back.
You actually look like Ronald Reagan.
Yes, he was a very handsome guy.
Nobody's even told that before.
Please.
What were the political dynamics like from back when you started, like back with Ford into now? What are the similarities? And
There aren't any similarities, except they still have the same work address of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Beyond that, I don't want to discourage you, Celeste. I've never experienced Washington, D.C. as toxic and divided as this is today. I remember, for example, under Reagan, Tip O'Neill was the Speaker of the House, and there was no more pure Democrat in America than Tip O'Neill. They couldn't agree on what time of day it was, but they had this relationship of we can disagree without being disagreeable. They didn't call each other names, and when 6 o'clock came, they'd go have a beer together. In fact, I remember one evening, some Secret Service guy called me, and I was in my office. It was about St. Patrick's Day, and it was about 6 o'clock. And he said, the president just said he's going somewhere. Well, I was in charge of where he goes, and I didn't have anything on the schedule, so I ran over to the Oval Office, and some friend of his is having a party over at some hotel, and he's decided to go. And Tip's with him. And these two have been in there drinking Irish beer for the last hour. Off they go to this party. That wouldn't happen today. We've lost track of civility. I was thinking about some things that I learned from Reagan. He was always cheerful, and that was part of his political strength, that he was cheerful. I remember when he was debating President Carter, and Carter said something or other, and Reagan just shook his head, well, there he goes again. You know, it's not a personal jab. He treated it with humor. Remember when he was assassinated or almost assassinated? That was the only public appearance he made that year, the only one where I was not with him at that hour. And I've always wondered what I did to not be there. Jim Brady, who was his press secretary, took 2 bullets in the head, and Brady always walked right behind me when we were getting in a motorcade movement. And Brady always said that he took those 2 bullets from me, and I've often wondered. But I remember Reagan's laying on the table, and it's never really been very well publicized, but the physician said there were 7 things he should have died from. And he didn't die of many of them, obviously. But as the physicians have told this story, that they're getting ready to put him under, he looks up at him and says, well, I hope you're all Republicans. In fact, there was a great story told by an emergency room nurse. She said, they wheeled a body in, said it's a gunshot wound. And her job was to start at the feet and cut the pants off whoever the gunshot victim is. And she said, I began to cut this suit and all of a sudden realized this is a really nice suit. And she said, I looked up and realized there's the President of the United States, the gunshot victim, looking at me. And she said, I started crying. And then she said, I realized this is not the time to cry, this is the time to buck it up. And so he should have died. He told Mother Teresa, they were having lunch, and he told her, he said, I believe the good Lord preserved my life so that I can devote it to freedom in America and freedom in the world. And he said, that's what I'm going to spend every waking minute on the rest of my presidency. He had a wonderful, in his re-election bid with Mondale, in that they debated 2 times. The first time was Reagan did horribly, you probably remember. He did very poorly, and he was getting criticized, well, maybe he's too old. Now, compared to where we are today, Reagan was younger. And Reagan, they asked him a question about age, and you remember the answer. He looked at Mondale and he said, I'm not going to make my opponent's youth and inexperience an issue in this race. And the election was over in that moment. The polls just flipped, and Reagan carried 49 states. So he dealt with those things with cheerfulness. He had an invigorating personality that helped. He was constant, completely constant. You may remember that there were, you Marines remember, there were 52 Americans taken hostage by the Iranians. And they were held for 444 days. And Reagan had made it known to the Iranians when he was campaigning that when I become president, either they're released that day or I will make your country a parking lot. He made it clear. And my first assignment in the White House in the Reagan presidency, in fact, we hadn't even found our officers yet, was to bring the hostages home from Iran. And I remember asking the hostages, did you know who won on election day? And they said, no, we didn't have any idea who won, but we had a calendar, we knew what day it was. And we began on election day to get not 2 bowls of Iranian gruel every day, but 9,000 or 10,000 calories a day. We knew who had won that election. And the Iranians couldn't get them out of there fast enough. In fact, this little piece has never been publicly told. We knew that they were going to clear Iranian airspace probably during Reagan's inaugural address. And Reagan had taken 2 of us aside, and we had a signal. This was the signal. And he would look over every once in a while. I was over there, and the other guy was over here. He would look, and this was the signal, if we were going to give the signal, which was to alert him when they had cleared Iranian airspace. Because his plan was to stop his inaugural address and invite President Carter, to whom Reagan felt would be owed the applause and the thanks for getting him free, to come up and take the podium. Now that's a magnanimous gesture. You talk about the divisiveness in Washington today, it wouldn't happen. But that was the kind of character we saw then. They did not clear Iranian airspace till a couple hours later. And just a little bit more aside on that. So Reagan then, and on Inauguration Day, the outgoing president goes home, okay? And the president, the incoming president, gives the outgoing president Air Force One for one last flight. And so Reagan grabbed Carter and said, I'd like you to represent the United States of America and go to Wiesbaden, Germany to welcome the hostages back to freedom. And so Carter and Vice President Mondale and Secretary of State Cyrus Vance went. And it was interesting. Not one of the hostages would shake Carter's hand.
Wow.
Not one of them would shake Mondale's hand. Some of them spoke Secretary Vance's hand. When they got to the White House, they all embraced Reagan far more than the handshake. They knew it was his consistency and firmness and clarity of public policy that got them free. And I could tell some more stories about that. One thing Reagan also did that we missed today is he communicated his vision clearly. Everybody knew where he stood. Remember the air traffic controller, some of you may? He said, they were on strike. And he said, you're not back to work by noon Friday, you're fired. Nobody believed that would happen. We just come from 4 years of President Carter, which was a very different style of leadership. Nobody was really sure much of anything. Tell you one little insight about the leadership style differences. At the White House, there's a tennis court. And under President Carter, he had in his desk drawer in the Oval Office the schedule for the tennis court. And if you wanted to play on the White House tennis court, you went in and saw the president, and he would write your name down on there. Reagan's style was very different. He said, here's the rules for the tennis court, don't bother me. He empowered his people and expected them to perform accordingly. And that was sort of how foreign policy worked. But remember, Reagan said you're fired on Friday, and they didn't show up for work, and he fired them all. That sent the most powerful message to our allies and our adversaries around the world about consistency of leadership. One thing Reagan did too is he took responsibility. Remember the Iran-Contra matter? He went on television, gave a national address, said, I don't think we did wrong, but the facts seem to say we did, so I take responsibility and I apologize. We don't see that today in Washington, D.C. It's somebody else's fault with everything. And we miss that. Reagan really valued and trusted his people. One day I remember there were these two Navy pilots shot down a couple of Libyan MiGs somewhere over near Africa, over the Indian Ocean. And Reagan was strongly criticized for not getting out of bed in the middle of the night and dealing with it. And his answer was, why? They did what we commissioned them to do and trained them to do and empowered them to do. That was the end of that. He had a sign on his desk in the Oval Office that said, there's no limit to what a man can do or where he can go if he does not mind who gets the credit. And it was interesting. This little plaque on a little stand faced where he sat, okay? And every time Alexander Haig would come in the Oval Office, he was Secretary of State at the time, when Al would come in, Al would go over and turn the plaque around so it faced the meeting. And then when the meeting was over and everybody leave, Reagan would go turn it back to himself. And one day Al Haig came in and turned it around, and Reagan fired him in the meeting and never turned it back. But Reagan felt it was really important, not who got the credit, that we do the job. And in Washington today, everybody wants credit, and nobody wants blame or responsibility. It's somebody else's doing. He believes strongly in dignity of public office. I don't know that he ever called anybody a name. The worst he ever said was evil empire, speaking of the Soviet Union, which it was. He treated everyone with courtesy. All the presidents I worked for treated everyone with courtesy. I remember once presidents don't travel elegantly as you think. When they come out of the hotel, they always ride the freight elevator and go out the garbage entrance. It's the safest entrance. It's where they can secure it. And we were coming out the garbage entrance of the Little America Hotel in Salt Lake City. We'd ridden down this freight elevator. We're about 20 feet out of the elevator, and Reagan turned around and walked back in the elevator. We don't know what he's doing or where he's going. He goes back to the elevator operator and says, oh, will you please forgive me for not saying thank you? Went over and shook his hand. Whether it was the Queen of England or the elevator operator, the presidents I worked for treated them with equal respect and equal dignity. So that's one of the things that's really different than today. And I don't want to get partisan politics on the front agenda here at this Republican event. But President Biden gave an address a year or so ago where he stood in front of a red backdrop with two Marines disgracefully utilized as props. And and absolutely excoriated basically everyone in this room. I never served a president that ever would speak that way. They loved all Americans, respected them and appreciated them and valued them and treasured their different points of view. So it's different today.
We have a lot of people who have thrown their hat in for president, for the nomination for Republicans. And my wonderment is, do we have a candidate that can win that independent vote? Because I think Republicans will vote Republican, Democrats will vote Democrat. So it's going to come down to those unaffiliated independent voters who are going to determine who our
A
next
Republican
president is.
cannot get elected president without the independents.
Right.
Cannot, mathematically cannot do it.
So do we have someone that's a candidate that can get that vote?
Well, Reagan was a very strong defender of the, what do you call it, the 11th commandment? Thou shalt never speak ill of a fellow Republican. I personally, I'm not sure we yet have that candidate amongst the candidates that have announced.
Exactly.
I'm watching for Glenn Youngkin, the governor of Virginia. I saw an interview recently where his lieutenant governor was interviewed. And I remember they said describe him, and the first word she used was humble. I thought, wow, there's a word we haven't heard in presidential politics lately. As long as our message, our Republican message, continues to be an attack message, a belligerent message, or divisive message, we will not capture independence. When we start with a message about what's great about America, what we can do for America and for Americans, I think right here we got the most recent candidate any one of us has seen in Celeste. Go back. Sorry, I didn't mean to embarrass you.
Just worried where this is headed.
I can go either way right now, huh? I listened to a number of her messages. Nothing in there was divisive or negative or belligerent or attacking. It was positive. And it was about where we ought to be and who we ought to be as people. This is the greatest country in the world, bar none. We're right now not in good shape with our allies or our adversaries. Our position in foreign policy in the world today is terrible. They don't trust us. What we did in Afghanistan, our exit from Afghanistan, nothing to do with partisanship. It was just horribly, disgracefully, shamefully executed. And we left behind literally hundreds of thousands of Afghanis who had been loyal to us and with us, and to whom we made commitments and we abandoned them. We can't have that kind of lack of character in our presidential leadership. It's not on the ballot. Character is not a box we check. It's too bad. But that's how we'll get the independence.
So who's advising these candidates? Because somebody needs to advise them that they need to be sharing the message you're talking about, rather than being so divisive and not attracting those independents to vote for us.
I've had 3 different candidates call and invite me to be involved, and I told them I was busy that year. So I don't know. I mean, a lot of the candidates, and you've talked to professional campaign advisors. A lot of them, it's driven by reading poll data, for example.
Which that had Celeste at 9% a few days ago. So polls are stupid.
The presidents I work for all thought that, and they're very fluid. And what's a poll on the 3rd may on the 8th be totally invalid.
And then even at the end, they may be totally wrong.
Well, the
That's
polls.
happened in the past.
I remember on Reagan's first election, we were 6 or 7 days out, and the polls had him losing.
Yeah.
And it was an interesting thing. We were in California at his house in Pacific Palisades on election night, and Jimmy Carter telephoned him at 5 p.m. Pacific time to concede. That doesn't happen. The polls are still open in 3 time zones, which then had an enormous down ballot effect. The Democrats didn't turn out. We picked up several United States Senate seats that we didn't expect to pick up. And I remember, just as an aside, Reagan said, well, he was in the shower, and they had to get him out of the shower to come and talk to President Carter. And he said, well, now what do we do? And they were scheduled to go to someone's home for dinner. Well, let's just go now. Well, we didn't have a motorcade. We had to assemble it. It was supposed to be there at 8 o'clock or something like that. We went out on the street and stopped the first Chevrolet cars that came along. Said, how would you like to drive a motorcade for the next president of the United States? And I remember one of the cars we stopped was Zsa Zsa Gabor. And she was a driver in the motorcade. I think I have other questions. I apologize. Gotten off track here.
Queen Elizabeth.
I met her three times. Her Majesty was charming, all Brit. I remember first time I met her was on her yacht, the HMS Britannia. And I remember I was with another staff person who were kind of standing over here. And Her Majesty came over to us to see if we'd been offered a drink. And I thought, wow. And second time I met her was at Reagan's ranch. And she had to ride in a Jeep because there'd been this terrible storm and the road was kind of washed out. She said, I know how to ride in a Jeep. I drove a Jeep in World War II. Let's go. She piles in. And then the third time was at Buckingham Palace. And we were preparing for the president's visit. I don't know which president it was. And our staff had been there getting ready. And our lead staff guy, I remember, this tells you a lot about Queen Elizabeth. His name was John Gartland. And he had become so British and pompous during the time he was preparing for the U.S. visit, and so representative of Her Majesty's interests instead of America's, that the staff began to call him Sir John. So Queen Elizabeth's sitting there, and she and I are making sure, I'm asking her if everything is satisfactory, and she wants to know if everything for our side is satisfactory. And I asked her about such and such. I don't remember the question. But she said to me, well, what does Sir John think? And I thought, she's got a great sense of humor. She was just a wonderful, elegant world leader who understood duty on her country. And first and foremost in her everything was duty to her country. I remember we were, I forgot about this one. Yeah, we were Windsor Castle. And she wanted to do something with Ron that wasn't typical head of state to head of state. And she and I discussed this, and it was determined that she and Ron would go for a horseback ride. And they did. So she was wonderful. Please.
Yes, I just wondered what Ronald Reagan's relationship was with Israelis. Did you meet like Yasser Arafat, or did you deal with them?
Yeah, I met Yasser Arafat. What a crooked, corrupt guy. Now, that's not an anti-Palestinian question. That's just a statement of documented fact. When he died, it was estimated that his wife had $1 billion in her Swiss bank accounts. The Palestinian question is one that just isn't resolvable, I don't think. And Reagan had a very strong, as did every president I worked for, a very strong view that America's ally, first and foremost in the Middle East, was Israel. It's the only true democracy in the Middle East today. Unfortunately, currently, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia probably was responsible for the murder of the journalist for the Washington Post. You all know the story. And President Biden said some very derogatory things about the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. And it's reciprocation time right now. Look at how Biden went over there. And it was, that to me was just an enormous statement of failed foreign policy. For the President of the United States to arrive at the airport in any Middle Eastern country and for the leader of the country to not be at the airport to greet them is an enormous affront. By every Middle Eastern rule, that's just wrong. And they then went to the palace, and the Crown Prince, not the king, received him on the front steps. And Biden was there to ask him to increase oil production. And the Saudis cut oil production. We've asked them not to deal with the Russians during this current Ukraine-Russian conflict. They've increased their dealings with Russia. So our Middle East policy, to the extent we have one, if you look at it, that's why I was in Washington, was on a Kurd issue, not cheese curds, Kurdish issue. The United States policy with respect to the Kurds. In Turkey, we label them as terrorists. Why? Because we needed Erdogan, who's the president of Turkey, to cozy up with NATO and the US, not with Putin and the Russians. And he's always vacillating. In Syria, we need the Kurds to cozy up with us. So they're our allies because they're fighting Assad and Putin. So it's a very complicated issue. And all of them will tell you, we just don't trust you Americans anymore.
What was your experience with President Trump?
Three times a year, this sounds very self-serving. 3 times I was offered a job in the White House, in that administration. And 3 times I said, no, thank you. I'm too old. I just didn't want to do it. I was privileged to serve presidents who, everybody who worked in the building knew what the president's goal was. And there was some point on the horizon for America to which they expected all of us to steer everything we did. The Trump White House didn't have that. It was often schizophrenic. I didn't want to be in that arena. I also worked for presidents who loyalty is a two-way street. I remember Reagan once told us on the very first day of his administration, there was a group of us in the Oval Office. He said, there's 3 requirements to work on my staff. Do you know what they were? What is it?
Loyalty, loyalty, loyalty.
Yeah. Not that you should be loyal to something illegal, but if you're not loyal to what the goals and visions of the president are, don't work here. And I had several colleagues in the Trump White House who weren't sure really what those goals were. And loyalty was not reciprocated, and I chose not to. I did do some assignments outside, but no, I didn't want to go back full time.
Do you think that some of the reasons why the disloyalty or they didn't know where it was is because a lot of the staff was still from Obama's?
Yeah, I think that's clearly a factor. The presidents I worked for cleaned house.
Yeah.
They cleaned house on day 1,
Right.
not 8 months into an administration. And part of that comes from the fact, remember, Trump had never held a position of government anywhere. And you can tell an outsider that there's a deep state or an administrative state, they don't believe you.
Do you believe that he accomplished a lot in his 4 years?
I think Trump's accomplishments in many areas were extraordinary. In public policy, especially in his judicial appointments, and most especially in the Supreme Court appointments.
Right.
If we didn't have the Supreme Court we have today, the country, I think, would be in serious trouble.
Oh, right.
More than we already are.
We all have that.
Well, my time is up. I was thinking about Marines. Anybody in here, anybody besides you, Marines? Stand up and tell us how many years you served our country.
4 years in the 19th Special Forces Army, and then 28 years in the Marine.
So, anybody in here been to Beirut, Lebanon recently? Well, you remember during, I think it was Reagan's presidency.
I was actually in there. It wasn't recent.
Were you there then?
It was right after the bombing.
Okay. On a Sunday morning, a cowardly terrorist, and all terrorists are cowardly, drove a truckload of explosives into the U.S. Marine barracks near the airport in Beirut and brought down the building and killed 241 Marines and some Navy corpsmen. And Reagan wanted to memorialize those Marines. And I remember I was given the assignment, and we went to Camp Lejeune, where most of them were from Camp Lejeune. South Carolina, north? North. So I went down there, and I remember the night before the president was supposed to be there, a couple things happened. Some man called me. How he got my name and number, I don't know. This man called me, and he said, sir, I have a son who's a captain in the Marine Corps in Beirut, and they haven't found him yet. Well, he and I both knew that he was dead, buried under this rubble of this several-story tall building. He said he has a 12-year-old grandson who has written a poem for the president about his father's love of America. Is there any way he could get that to the president? And I said, no, you and your grandson and your family are gonna come and present it personally to the president. So anyway, the night before the president was to be there, I went over to the hospital, and I'm with a guy, you'll know his name, Al Gray. He was a two-star general, and Al became the commandant of the Marine Corps later. And Al was a Marine, tough old bird. He told me, he said, yeah. He said, this damn Marine Corps, he said, when I became a general, they told me I had to get a wife. I said, well, what'd you do? He said, well, I called head of purchasing and told him to get me one. And she's Mrs. Gray. Anyway, I remember he had a pistol on this hip with 2 stars on it, and a portable spittoon on this hip with 2 stars on it. And he invited me to go jump out of a helicopter at 4 a.m. with him, and I told him I was busy and couldn't go. But he and I went over to the hospital the night before the president was to be there. And there were 17 young injured Marines there. Now, you know they got to be pretty badly hurt to be brought all the way back from the Middle East to Camp Lejeune. So General Gray, who was as tough a Marine as you'll find, and I and the senior surgeon of the hospital went through all 17 of them. And I'll never forget. The doctor said, all right, 6 of them are well enough that they can attend, but they have to stay on their gurneys or in a wheelchair. And I remember General Gray said to them, all right, you 6 can attend, but you'll stay in your wheelchairs or on your stretchers. This one young Marine, maybe 18 years old, kind of sat up, and these are badly injured guys. He sat up and he looked at this tough 2-star general and he said, sir, when my country's flag is presented, I stand and render honors, sir. Now that told me a lot about the caliber of people serving in our military and how they stand, they know what they stand for and they stand for it. So the next morning, we fly in on Marine One, which is the president's helicopter, and it was a driving rainstorm. If you put on your best Sunday clothes and got in the shower and turned it on full blast and stood there a week, you wouldn't be as wet as you would have been that morning. The heavens just opened and cried for those Marines. Here's 10,000 Marines standing in formation. President comes in, sits down, ceremony begins, and I begin to count. There's not 6 of these injured Marines, there's 17 of them. So I get up and quietly walk my way around to find this, I think he was the colonel, head of the hospital. And I said, Colonel, you told me that only 6 of them are well enough to attend, but I count 17. Yes, sir. He wasn't very forthcoming with any answers. And I said, what are they doing here? He said, well, at 7 o'clock this morning, they began to wheel themselves out the front door of the hospital. Nothing we could do to stop them. That's the caliber of young men and young women we have serving in our country. They knew who they were and what they stood for. During that same terrible episode, there was a 19-year-old PFC who was so badly injured in that terrorist attack that he was medevac back from Beirut to Washington, D.C. to Bethesda Naval Hospital. The commandant, I'd tell you his name if I could think of who it was. In fact, I have to go back and tell you just one little aside. Can I do that? Back to Jimmy Carter and the hostages. There were 9 Marine guards at the embassy when they were taken hostage in Iran. The Iranians released them early. So now it comes the time that we're inviting these 52, we're bringing them home from Iran, and they're coming to the White House, and the plan was to invite these Marine embassy guards. The Commandant of the Marine Corps phoned me. This is like my first day in the White House, in the Reagan White House. And he said, sir, if you invite those Marine guards, I will resign my commission today. It was their duty to stay at their post. And if it meant to give their lives, that was their duty, not to accept a release by the Iranians. And I thought, boy, does that speak for the character of people that we have leading our military. So anyway, back to this one that was this 19-year-old PFC who was medevac from Beirut to Bethesda Naval Hospital. The commandant himself told me this story. He went up to see this young Marine. The young Marine was critically injured, both legs broken, one arm broken, massive internal injuries, massive injuries to his head. His head was completely bandaged, except he had openings in his nose and his mouth to take nourishment and to breathe. They thought he'd lose his eyesight in both eyes. Commandant leaned down to this young Marine and said, "Son, it's the Commandant." The Commandant told me this young Marine had one hand that kind of worked. He reached up and grabbed his lapel. Now, why would he do that?
Count the stars.
Count the stars. So with his fingers, he counted 4 stars. Now, at that moment, oh, this is the Commandant. Most would let go, wouldn't they? He didn't. He pulled a little harder such that the Commandant's ear was near his mouth. And with all the physical strength that he could summon, spoke 2 words, Semper Fi. The Marine Corps motto meaning always faithful. I'm grateful for those who serve our country, whether in uniform or civilian clothes of Congress. I'm grateful for those who serve with character and honor and integrity, and who know what this country stands for, and who want it to be the best that it's always intended to be from the first day of the founders. And I appreciate you letting me serve. And for a kid in Spanish work, I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. We appreciate it for taking the time to be with us, especially after just flying back from DC. So thank you. Let's give him one more round of applause. Thank you for joining us tonight. Appreciate all of you guys. We'll be back for luncheons next month, October. And there was one more calendar item I forgot to mention. You'll want to mark your calendar for November. Now I got to double check so I don't tell you wrong. November 17th. It's a Friday, I believe. Many of you are probably familiar with Riley Gaines, the NCAA swimmer that swam against the transgender swimmer. She's coming to St. George, so you won't want to miss that. We just started a College Republicans Club back on campus. And so if you know college kids, or please invite them. We'll keep you posted as it gets closer. So thank you. I will take a motion to adjourn and let you get on your way. Thank you. All right. Have a great night. Thank you.
Haley, board meeting tomorrow?
Yes.
1:30?
1:30.
At the library?
Uh-huh.